Yeah, I'm making sure we're starting the recording.
Yes, sirree.
There we go. And now on to the highlight of the evening. I'd like to present to you a Lincoln Beachey scholar, and we're going to find out all about this interesting fellow, a Bay Area native, Lincoln Beachey. Our speaker tonight is actually born in Tennessee, lived in California for many years, but he's coming to us tonight from the Netherlands. So it's 3 o'clock in the morning where he is. So be sympathetic to him and let's welcome Frank Marrero.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, I assume everyone there is, I assume they're interested in aviation, that we have some pilots in the audience, and um, and that you have maybe heard of Lincoln Beachey, but I'm going to assume you haven't. I did a 3 hour presentation of Lincoln Beachey at Hiller Aviation Museum over the 2 or 3 times over the last few years. I haven't been there in 6 years, but tonight for this, I'm going to smush it down to less than an hour. 40 minutes is my hope. And but one thing I want to say up front: this story is so fantastic. It's so wowie zowie that it's actually hard to imagine that this is not a common name, that everybody doesn't know about Lincoln Beachey. We'll get into that on another as we go along. But for instance, the original name proposed for the San Francisco Airport was the Lincoln Beachey Memorial Flying Park. So you once upon a time you were going to fly into not SFO but Lincoln Beachey Memorial Flying Park. This all faded, and this most famous aviator pioneer has become commonly unknown. But once upon a time, he was one of the most famous people in the world. He was a little loose with his morals. He had a girlfriend in every city. That didn't sit well for his posterity. And he did things that no one had ever thought of or tried before. And they said, well, he's just crazy. Until late, they realized, oh my God, here's a new genius. But that was so close to the end of his life that fact that he was had too many girlfriends uh, made it so that he was easy to forget. And right as he died, the Lusitania was sunk, and the United States went into a First World War. So that kind of is one of the reasons we don't everybody know him, and the reason that we don't flying into Lincoln Beachey Memorial flight. But that's just my little preview. I want to emphasize this is a difficult thing to wrap your head around, that someone so famous is now commonly unknown. So I'm going to go to screen share and show you a few so you flew slides. And here, oops, we got to go back to the beginning. Beginning, there we go. And here we go.
We can
So
see it.
good, thank you. So Lincoln Beachey, the reason I say he was the greatest aviator of all time, well, that's not just my opinion. This is the opinion of his rivals. This is a world class, everybody admitted this guy is the greatest. As you see him here on the right, he's doing this is from the height of the top of the Golden Gate Bridge. Top of the Golden Gate Bridge goes 660 feet. Imagine somebody doing this in 1914 and then landing. He mastered the loop. We'll get into the known as Master Birdman, Alexander, as in Alexander the Great, of the air, the man who owned the sky, the forgotten father of aerobatics, the divine flyer, Master Birdman, and more. Of course, I'm cramming 3 hours into 40 minutes or so, and I'm skipping about 3/4 of the story for tonight. But all the details pictures are available in the book, Lincoln Beachey, The Man Who Owned the Sky, by yours truly, and it's available at Hiller Aviation Bookstore and Amazon. So let me give you just a little bit of framework before we launch. Historically, this was a time of unbelievable idealism. They said, "Science save us all. We're going to know all the answers," and they had some good reason to think this. The 1890s was the pivot in world history to machines for travel. Before that, before 1890, people personal transportation was by animal, horse and buggies, horses. And then in 1890s, we had the safety bicycle taking over America. In 1899, the first electric lights were 99, the first motor car went Avenue. The one of the senators, U.S. senators, wanted to save money. He said, "Well, we should close the patent office because obviously everything's already been invented." Yeah, and another idealism there was that when we started World War One, people said, "Oh, we'll just keep doing business together." And the theme of the slogan of the first world of the Panama Pacific International Expo, the World's Fair of 1915, was peace through commerce. So there's this historical idealism that you'll see throughout this story. Of course, some people saw right through it. In 1899, Conrad's The Heart of Darkness talked about the shadow side of all this commercialism. And Nietzsche said, "Woe is him who hides the wasteland within." T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland just after this time, and Yeats wrote The Sinner Will Not Hold. So that's a kind of a academic view. Let's go to Beachey's personal framing. He was born on March 3rd, 1887, south of San Francisco. His father, who had been injured in the Civil War, was slowly going blind and finally went completely blind and had to leave for a home to take care of blind veterans. He was raised by a single mom and his older brother, Hillary. And Hillary and Stan Hiller, from which we get the Hiller Museum, they were friends later in life. But they lived in poverty. When Beachey was about 10 years old, he said he quit school, said, "I know enough now," threw his books on a pile and said, "I'm going to help support the family." He got a newspaper route, took a ferry over to Oakland every day, for which we'll hear about soon later. He did bike tricks, and he was known as one of the best bicyclists in San Francisco. And he even supported his family by doing vaudeville acts on a bicycle, doing bike tricks. When he quit school, his mother said, "What's he going to work? I'm going to go into the most, as a good San Franciscan, high tech," which was being a mechanic. That was high tech in about the turn of the last century. So his mother bought him a broken down motor, and he fixed it and was on his way. He also was known as having the largest bird wing collection. He loved watching the birds around the ferry dive for breadcrumbs he would throw into the birds as he took the ferry to Oakland to his paper route. At 18, he was chosen by Captain Thomas Scott to fly the world's second dirigible. Now, dirigible is a word that comes from directionable. Before dirigibles, balloons just went up and went whichever way the wind was blowing. But by making a ship in a ship shape with a rudder, you could actually take off and land back where you went. Baldwin and Beachey, with Baldwin in the controls, launched the United States' first directionable or dirigible from a city park at 57th and Telegraph in Oakland on the Oakland-Berkeley line, flew out to the bay and back. And then later, Beachey at 18 did the same. He was the second one. he was the big name in the air, Lincoln Beachey, pilot of dirigibles. And he went around the country, uh, headliner. He, without asking, attacked Washington, D.C., landed on the White House lawn, spoke to Eleanor Roosevelt, attacked the Capitol, landed on the steps of the Capitol. Every fair in the country wanted him. He was the big name, the number one name in the air in a dirigible. But we're going to skip that period of his life and we're going to go straight to, I know it will work. Let's see. There we go. I want to give you just a.
What you're about to hear and see may be hard for you to imagine. Let me tell you about one of the most famous people in American history. He rose from poverty in 19th century San Francisco to absolute glory, as he was called, Alexander of the Air, the Divine Flyer, and the world's greatest aviator. First to fly up after the loop-de-loop. Lincoln Beachey is the forgotten father of aerobatics, the first man to outfly the birds. During his day, he was known by sight to hundreds of thousands and by name to the whole world. Lincoln Beachey played to the largest crowds in American history, and his funeral in San Francisco was said to be the largest in the city's history. He achieved the very acme of American adoration, and it is hard to imagine that someone so famous could become so forgotten. The first official biographer of the U.S. Air Force, Colonel Hans Christian Adamson, said it best. It is hard to imagine the adoration that followed Lincoln Beachey everywhere. He was DiMaggio. He was Lindbergh at his prime. He was all the stars of stage and screen combined, with a touch of Superman thrown in. From one end of the country to the other, he was known as the man who owned the sky.
Now, we're going to jump in Beachey's career about to the halfway point. In January, in 1909, the world's first air show, air meet, air contest was held in Reims, France. And Curtis won the event, and he confronted the Wrights as the world's greatest aviator at the time. And the Wrights were very secretive and very litigious, meaning they brought lawsuits against everybody. Most people don't know this, but in the early part of the 20th century, the Wrights were hated nationally. They were so litigious, they were brought such lawsuits. They were the actual stick in the mud against flying. Because they wanted everybody to pay them for everything, as if they had invented flying. They didn't invent flying. They invented lateral control, which was the last and significant key invention, but they did not invent flying. Flying had the first person to fly regularly was Lilienthal, who flew gliders regularly. They took all the information and did great things, really great things, but they wanted to claim everything. And they really got their patent only for one thing, and that was a lateral control, or keeping it from tilting to one side to the other. So when Curtis won Reims in France, he was now had the mantle as the great aviator, and so he decided to have a show, an air meet in America, and decided to be in Orange County, or at Dominguez Field, just south of Los Angeles. This was the beginning of a new epoch. The phrase, as difficult as flying, meant impossible. prior to this day, January 10th in 1910, when people wanted to say, well, that's impossible, they would say, oh, that's as difficult as flying. That was the phrase, the common phrase to say that's impossible. And the newspapers reported the phrase as difficult as flying ended that day. When Curtis took off, the most significant thing about what people noted was the absolute silence as people mouths dropped that someone actually did fly. No one had ever seen anyone fly publicly until Curtis took off on January 10th, 1910. At the air meet, they had all kinds of machines. Some flew, some didn't, and they had a race, a dirigible race between the number one and the number two dirigiblists in the country, Shoe and Beachey. Beachey won the race, but as he was taking in his glory, an airplane from Poland's airplane literally flew circles around him. Beachey realized that he was now upstage. He could no longer get glory by being in a bag full of air. So he went to Curtis and said, hey, I don't know you. You probably know me. I'm the number one name in the air. I'll be glad to fly for you. And Curtis said, no, I don't need another flyer. So he went to the Wrights. He says, hey, look, I'm the number one flyer in the air. I'll be glad to work for you. And they said, no, it'll cost you $500, which was a lot of money in those days. And then we get half of everything you earn. Well, no. So he went back to Curtis and said, look, take me on as a mechanic. I'm a really good mechanic. And he did. Now, Beachey was really he got his chances to try to fly, and he was really lousy at first. He took off too soon. He was too anxious to get into the air. He would take off and just slam down. And he spent most of his free time fixing landing gear. Now, one thing I want you to understand about 1910 is that 1 in 3 flights ended in disaster or they called it the deadly spiral. Pilots in the crowd will know the deadly spiral as stall recovery, except there was no recovery in 1910. So when stall, one wing fails, your plane off to one side and you go into a spiral. And 1 in 3 flights is bad odds, by the way. So it was a deadly year. Now, in December of 1910, Curtis and Wrights were having a competition to sell planes back in Los Angeles. And the story goes, the true story, that Curtis's number one pilot, it was a very windy day, Hamilton, got thrown down and was injured. And they said, who's going to fly the planes for you, Curtis? And Beachey says, I'll do it. And he says, oh my God, I'm going to have to trust this whole event to my guy who can't land. And so reluctantly, he let Beachey go up. Now, Beachey went up to about 3,000 feet. And as he reached the 3,000 foot mark, something was wrong with the airplane after all, and the engine stopped cold. He went into a deadly spiral, and he started spiraling toward the earth. So many people died in airplanes that the crowds were ravenous. They would rush out of the stands to literally strip the aviators so they could get a souvenir off of a man who had gone up close to heaven, according to them. And it was an awful, terrible, bloodthirsty event when somebody died. Beachey's spinning toward the earth. And as the pilots in the crowd will tell you, your first instinct is to pull out of the spin and up from the fall. And that makes it worse, way worse. It's the most counterintuitive thing to do. So Beachey just surrendered to dying. And as he relaxed, he remembered back when he was a kid, and he's written this down. He remembered back to when he was a kid, and he would watch the seagulls dive for his breadcrumbs that he would throw off the ferry. And he realized in that moment that if he dove into the spiral, into the deadly spiral, make it apparently worse, that might work. And sure enough, he dove into his deadly spiral, and enough wind started going by his control flaps that made him come back to life again, and he did the world's first dead stick landing. He also said that he could feel the airplane for the first time, and he suddenly knew that he was the world's first complete aviator. He went from LA to right up to San Francisco where there was an aviation meet. He entered as a novice and won the meet hands down. So that's as he was a.
It was Beachey who was the champion of Tanforan. Curtis realized that his investment in Beachey was about to pay off and sent him on a tour up the East Coast, starting in Puerto Rico. Beachey's was the first aeroplane not only in San Juan, but in most cities he visited. On May 5th, 1911, he flew by the nation's capital, the first aeroplane to do so, repeating his dirigible feat 5 years earlier and providing a foreshadowing of something to come. Beachey was the first aeroplane to fly over Manhattan, and it was reported that New York's Broadway stood as still as a country lane. Flying from New York to Philadelphia was in fact part of a race that Beachey indeed won, and his feat was seen by over 5 million people. But Beachey's leap into immortality began in Niagara on June 26, 1911. 250,000 people came out in the rain in hope of seeing an aeroplane dare the mighty falls. From this city park at 9th and Niagara, Beachey took off as hundreds of people swarmed into the area, requiring dozens of policemen to hold them back. Beachey flew out, over and behind the falls, and after climbing to 1,500 feet, then dove at the cusp of the falls until he disappeared into the mist. Parents covered their children's eyes. Young women fainted by the thousands. On his aeroplane, the mist blinded Lincoln Beachey as he pulled back on the controls with all of his might and shot out from the bottom of the falls. But too much water in his carburetor killed his engine, and he fell back toward the turbulence, his engine kicking back in just inches before disaster. Indeed, he roared under Honeymoon Bridge, collected his fortune, and received the adoration reserved for Olympians. That night, he rode in an open car through the streets of both Niagaras as tens and tens of thousands of people lined the streets to gaze upon the kind of person that would brave everything. A consortium of 100 newspapers nationwide called him the eighth wonder of the world. But the moniker of crazy began.
Now, Beachey hated this moniker of crazy, but he took his newfound fame to Chicago just a few weeks later for what was called the greatest aviation meet of all time. This is, for those who've not been to Chicago, this is the lakefront. Michigan Avenue is just off to the left, and there was many people came. Sopwith from England came. Beachey is down here, and he was determined to win this. However, he noticed that Sopwith came with a plane with an engine as strong as the Curtiss that he was doing, but he had a monoplane, a plane that was lighter. And Sopwith continued to beat him in things like the fast climb and other things that required a maneuverability. He noted this, but he was quite determined to still be the crowd's #1 favorite. He one of his favorite routines at this event was he dressed up as a woman and announced that he was Madame Clarice Lesueur, Beachey's student, and he got ready to take off. And the crowd here is 200,000 people came out to see this. And as Beachey took off, sorry.
That was when you soloed Charles Lindbergh?
You're Beachey in Chicago in 1911.
Yes, sir.
There we
I've
go.
seen
Back
him.
to this. Sorry, technical difficulties. So he got ready to take off, and as he took off, Beachey had little wires attached to his seat right here and there, and so that he could control his seat. I mean, control the ailerons going left to right, controlling the aeroplanes with his weight leaning back and forth in the seat. He could control the rudder with his knees. So what he did as he took off, he pretended he let his dress fly up over his head, pretending that he couldn't get the dress away from his face, and wildly threw his arms out, help, 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 and flew directly at the crowds and the grandstand. He pulled up only 8 feet from hitting all the people, screaming wildly, help, help, help. He was fined several $100s for this stunt, by the way. He didn't care. And then he went flying down Michigan Avenue in Chicago, doing what they call the turkey trot, screaming, help, 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 with this dress over his face, and touching one wheel to the streets, then the other wheel to the cobblestone, and dancing back and forth down Michigan Avenue. Cars that couldn't get out of the way ran, or he ran and launched himself with his wheels across the back of the cars as he launched himself into the air. Once he got back up in the air, he noticed that this plane went by, flown by Cal Rogers. Now, for you aviation historians, Cal Rogers is the first man to fly across America. And Beachey saw Cal Rogers flying underneath him, and he swooped down, lost control of his poor machine again, and rolled his wheels across Cal Rogers' top wing. Cal freaked out, dumped his plane into Lake Michigan. And as he dumped his plane into Lake Michigan, Beachey saw this ferry out there full of people. You know, they hadn't paid their admission. They were watching shows for free. And poor Madame Levasseur, she lost control of the airplane again, went spiraling right at this ferry. They said that the people jumped in mass, including the elderly, by the hundreds, jumped into the water to keep from being smashed. But fortunately, poor Clarice Levasseur pulled up at the last second, landed her machine. She landed back in where she took off miraculously, bowed 3 times, and the third bow, he leaned forward, pulled his wig off, and revealed that it was Lincoln Beachey all along. Now, Beachey was second in this, but he was wanting to always get the crowd's attention. So he decided after coming in second in the fast climb to come back down and dance across the tops of the railroad cars coming into the town by dancing his wheels on top of the railroad car. And I have an interview with a man that was there. He flew with Beachey in 1911. Now he went to the 80th reunion. I'll let the words 80th reunion sink in. Not many people show up to the 80th reunion of anything, but he showed up to the 80th reunion and told this story.
That was when you soloed Charles Lindbergh?
Oh, hang on, I got
Beachey in Chicago in 1911.
Yes, sir.
I
got to say just one more. That's when he said, this man then went on to teach Charles Lindbergh how to fly. He soloed Charles Lindbergh. So I just got that little piece in there so you would know.
It was when you soloed Charles Lindbergh?
I soloed Charles Lindbergh. Beachey in Chicago in 1911.
Yes, sir.
I had seen him, I think, twice before that at different fairs around the country, and I don't even remember which one it was because I visited so many of those fairs. But the thing that impressed me most at the Lincoln Beachey in Chicago was they were on lakefront,
Uh-huh.
And the Illinois Central Railroad runs right along lakefront. And the railroad, the IC Railroad Station up there just this side of the library, or the museum rather. And he got up and come down over those freight cars. As you know, there's a wheel sticks up on each one of them about 2 feet above the top of the car, which is a brake wheel,
Yes, sir.
where they can put on brakes on the individual cars if they switch them into a switch track. And he came down and touched his front wheel on top of one of those cars. They did up over a couple more cars and come down and put it on another.
Oh.
During that entire freight train, right up there, just bouncing up and down. It really impressed me because if he had made one miss bobble and hit one of those brake wheels setting up there, why it'd just been too bad. That's all.
Yeah.
I saw him at several fairs, or I say several, at least a couple of fairs before that.
Uh-huh.
And I saw him since that, 1 or 2 times. I don't remember now just where it was.
What'd you think about him?
I think of his time, he was the greatest aviator there was of his time.
Yes, sir.
Although, sir, at the Chicago Fair, Sir Thomas Sopwith won the event.
Uh-huh.
By his overall performance.
Yeah, Beachey came in second.
But Beach came in second, yes.
Uh-huh.
And he was a wonderful performer, a little bit on the egotistic side,
Uh-huh.
and thought he was at least as good as he was. But everybody accepted it. And they said, well, he is good.
Yeah.
And just let it go with that.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. Oh, I love hearing that. Oh, that's fantastic. So he was known by then as the world's greatest aviator, wasn't he?
That's right, that's right.
Now, at this event in Chicago, thank you, Glenn. At the very last, he really wanted to make a good showing. And at the last event was the altitude record. Who could climb the highest? And he was just beside himself that he was a little behind in his winnings. And so he went to the Curtis engineers and says, how come we can't enter the altitude record? And he says, Beachey, we have small wing, big engine planes. A little engine, big wing plane will win that. And he says, why? Why can't I go high as they can? They said, it's just a matter of petrol consumption. You look, and they showed him the charts on how much you can fly for 2 hours, and then you'll need so much petrol to get up and down. He went, oh, that's it. And they went, what do you mean that's it? He goes, who needs gas to get back down? Because you realize this is the man who invented dead stick drop. So he broke the world's altitude record, 11,642 feet, and then ran out of gas and then just dived down. So let me quickly go to the next presentation. There we go. And now Beachey traveled across the country after this, doing shows, racing Barney Oldfield. Barney Oldfield was known as the fastest man he was the race car driver supreme. And he and Eddie Rickenbacker, the other race car driver, Beachey raced them around tracks left and right all over America. It was quite the show. So Beachey would show off, of course, as he did this. As he passed Barney Oldfield, he would knock Barney Oldfield's hat off with his front wheel. One time Barney said, well, I still like racing planes rather than cars because planes kick up so much dust. I mean, cars kick up so much dust in my face. And so Beachey, who would just fly, they said Beachey would then, as he was racing Barney and passed him up, he would reach down with his wingtip and kick up dust with his wingtip. They said, how does he do that? They said, those aren't his wingtips, those are his fingertips. Here he's racing a racing a Harley Davidson. And here is an Indian motorcycle. This picture was drawn from a picture. That's the old Emeryville racetrack. And Beachey and Barney Oldfield did this show across America quite a lot. Here, look at this idealism. Oh my gosh. Beachey then also dropped bombs from his plane showing that the future of aviation, of wars, was going to be air. So, but hated this. He did things that nobody had ever done. And so they kept calling him crazy. He hated being called crazy. He says, I'm not crazy. I am the pioneer of a new art and science of aerobatics. I am, but people would go, oh yeah, sure you are. You're crazy. So when you get so far ahead of everybody else, people call you crazy, and he hated it. So now, so many people died imitating Beachey that they called him the pacemaker for death. And people left and right were dying because everybody else who wanted to make money in the aviation business had to do tricks that Beachey did. And so many people died that they called him the pacemaker for death. So he went to, but Beachey was not, he knew that that was not true. He knew that people weren't practicing the way he practiced. And so he knew that the planes, there was still future for what the planes could do. He went to Curtis in San Diego and said, Curtis, I want you to build me an airplane that will fly upside down. I want to loop the loop. And Curtis said, I'm in a legal fight with the Wrights. Pete, you already have a bad name. People are blaming you for every aviation death in the world. People trying to imitate you. I can't make you a plane that flies upside down. So dejected, he got on a train, changed trains in Los Angeles. And at the Los Angeles train station, his good friend, Charlie Walsh, had just died trying to do a Beachey, egged on by his wife. And his wife saw Beachey changing trains and she yelled at him, you killed Charlie. And so she decided he'd have to retire for a while. And he did. He retired and at the Olympic Club. And but then he was in retirement for 3 months, and he heard that Bigold had done the loop. Well, he said that was supposed to be mine, and he bolted out of retirement. Said, Curtis, you have to build me a plane that will fly in an upside down. And Curtis did. And as he came out of it, as he built it too heavy though, because there was too much stress on it, he flew too close to this tent. A girl slid off of it trying to get out of the way, hit her head on a bumper, and she died. He had finally caused the death of someone, and he was heartbroken. But they cleared him because he didn't hit her, but she did die trying to get out of his way. So he went to San Diego with Curtis at this point and practiced trying to go upside down. And the way he would do it, he would dive straight down and then turn upside down, do the first part of an outside loop. But as he flew upside down, at this point in history, they had not made fuel pumps. So as he would go upside down, the engine would quit on him. So he could only do it for such a time, for such a short time. So he really wanted a plane that would fly upside down all the time and stay on. But he sat there and worked it. And finally, he did the loop. He said that when he finally looped over, that he could truly outfly the birds. And he said, at that moment in history, something happened. He said he could feel the prayers of millions of people. Everybody who's ever lived has wanted to fly free into the air. He said all those prayers, he could feel those, that finally he could outfly the birds, that now humankind was free in the air upside down, looping, it didn't matter. He did inside loops, outside loops, multiple loops. He was the first to then master the loop. So he did. He went back up to San Francisco where he met Merced Walton. Now he was a ladies' man, but she was a stronger woman than he was. So she didn't buy his little "I'm cool and groovy and I'm the man" act. And so he had to drop his "I'm so cool" show, and they fell in love. And so he quit having a girlfriend everywhere. Now this is this is Merced Walton. This on the other side is Marie Merced, which she may be in the crowd tonight. I hope she waves later. She is the granddaughter. I don't know if you can see the striking resemblance of Marie Merced with her grandmother Merced. So Beachey falls in love with Merced Walton. He's in San Francisco, talk of the town. This is Beachey flying over the out west of the near the Western Addition, we can call it that. Flying is a picture of him, and he's the guest at high society. Here he is at. They go from. They have this dinner for him, and they do everything upside down. They start with dessert. They start with coffee, then have dessert, then have their main entree, then have salads, and then have cocktails. So they do everything upside down or backwards when they had as a prank because he was so famous with the locals. Realize this man is from San Francisco. Now he's returning as a world hero. While he was there, he noticed that the building had begun for the World's Fair. This is December 13th, December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1913. This building is the largest framed building on Earth. It was the Palace of Machinery. And so while it was still being built, it was a giant shell. And Beachey was touring it, said, hey, let's have the world's first indoor flight. And so this is a picture of him flying indoors. Now, his quest for upside down flight was answered. This is Glenn Martin. You may have heard of him, Martin Marietta, flies things into space. That company is still going. He calls Beachey and says, Beachey, I have the perfect airplane for you. I have a motor that stays on upside down because the motor spins. So this is Beachey traveling to Santa Barbara and looking at this spinning motor, this plane that Glenn Martin built. Now Glenn, when knowing that Beachey was coming, sold tickets so he could make some money. And he takes off, flies around, he flips the machine upside down, but the controls break. He's stuck upside down. So he, using only his rudder, he dives it into a tree and survives. And but now he's in love with that motor though. And so he decides he has to go get himself one. And he goes, and here he is boarding the Lusitania, where he goes to France, to the Gnome factory, where he's met in France by Eiffel. Yes, that Eiffel. He's Eiffel, who built the famous tower a few years before. Eiffel himself takes Beachey to the French-German border to buy 2 Gnome motors, where Beachey returns and puts them in the world's first fully aerobatic flying machine. This is the first plane ever built for aerobatics. And now he's separated himself from Curtis. He has Warren Eaton and Art Mix building his machinery, and he has the plane, which the motor which spins. This actual very airplane is hanging in the Hiller Aviation Museum. When you go to the Hiller Aviation Museum, you'll see this very plane hanging there. So this is the world's first fully aerobatic flying machine. On May 13th, he installs this machine, this motor in this machine waiting for him, and he decides to try it out. There are, just people heard about it, and 200,000 people show up spontaneously to watch him, and he dazzles them. When he came back down, they said, "What was that you just did?" And he took a piece of paper and he said, "This is it." And so he could do anything in an airplane now. And he proceeded, he was already a master. Now he just went in every direction. He invented science, what we know as aerobatics now. When he did this, people were just amazed. And somebody in the crowd yelled out, "You flew that thing every which way but backwards." Now, the aviators in the crowd won't believe this, except I have read dozens, I mean dozens of newspaper reports describing this feat. And they all say and describe it exactly. Beachey describes it in detail. What he does, he flies till he flies upward till he stalls, and then sits it on his tail, flying his machine backwards until he stalls it the other direction, and then forward again, cutting a Z. He said it was the most difficult maneuver he's ever done. He called it the tail slide, because he scratched out a Z in the air. I know a single aviator that goes, "Sure, that's possible." Everybody I've ever talked to said that's not true, that he never did that. And yet I have read dozens and dozens of newspaper accounts describing it. And I've heard, and you can also read Beachey's detailed description of how he did this. And that's what it was. It was a Z. Now, at this time, the Wrights win their lawsuit in 1914 against Curtiss. And everybody's really kings. And at this time, Mexico has 400 airplanes in their air fleet. Russia has over 1,000. Germany has over 1,000. France has 800. Like I said, Mexico has 400. United States has 23 because of this Wright lawsuit brigade. And so Henry Ford, right here, he goes and visits Glenn Curtiss, and Henry Ford is a master not only of the machinery but of patent law, and he shows Glenn Curtiss a flaw in the Wright's patent, and they're able to open again the patent lawsuit. But this cripples aviation in America, this lawsuits by the Wrights. And so Beachey is lobbying everywhere he goes. Literally, towns close when he comes. He goes on a 126 city tour of America, and he distributes 1 million brochures saying America has got to do something about this. And he's lobbying. He says, bring me to Washington so I can show where aviation really is. And so they finally say, "Okay, come." And he comes there, and there was 2 cabinet members, Secretary of War and forget the other, Secretary of Navy, says, he says, "Where's the president? Where's Congress?" He said, "Oh, you're supposed to show it to us and we'll tell everybody." Well, that wasn't good enough for Lincoln Beachey. He took off, and the story is that Woodrow Wilson was in the Oval Office working on neutrality papers about World War I. And when he hears a buzz, he thinks it's a fly. He picks up a fly swatter looking for the fly, but the buzzing gets louder and louder. He looked out the window, and coming right at the Oval Office is Lincoln Beachey, eyeball to eyeball. He doesn't pull up until the last possible second. It was said that Woodrow Wilson broke into a sweat. He came so close, and Beachey pulls up and then goes on as if he's in a diving bombing runs of complete devastation, as if he's destroying the White House. Then he flies over to the Capitol building and dive bombs the White House, the Capitol as well. Beachey speaks before Congress, and they finally decide to allocate money for a Air Corps, for an Air Force. And Beachey is nationally congratulated for finally getting America to begin an Air Force. This is the Secretary of War congratulating him there. His 126 city tour, he's known as the genius of aviation. Thomas Edison meets with him and just wows out. Carl Sandburg writes a poem to him. But Beachey saved his best for when he went to Dayton, because Orville Wright came out and said, oh, these things that Beachey says he's doing in his promotions, they don't happen. That's a promoter's hype. He probably does something way up in the air and says that's what he's doing. So Beachey ends his show in Dayton with a dozen consecutive loops right at the grandstand level, right in front of Orville Wright, with his arms outstretched, hands off the wheel. Then he goes up and flips his machine upside down and does a double Z, flies upside down backwards twice. And Orville Wright said, I have watched him closely with my glasses and never seen him make an error or falter. An aeroplane in the hands of Lincoln Beachey is poetry. He is the greatest aviator of all. That's from his rival. His rivals are saying he's the greatest of them all, the greatest aviator who ever lived. He was known by sight to hundreds of thousands and by name to the whole world. In 1914, 17 million people saw him in that one tour alone. Out of about 80 million people in America, 30 million people saw him. He got invitations after this. Now, let me give you an idea. A high school principal in that year made about $1,200 a year, about $100 a day. In a month. Now, compare that. So you have that in mind when Japan offers him $100,000 to come show them one show. How much money that would be today? Australia hearing about that saying, "Oh, if you come to Japan, we'll give you 50,000." So 150,000, so much more than a high school principal makes $1,200 a year. But Beachey turns these down because the World's Fair, Panama Pacific International Expo, celebrating the opening of the Panama Canal, is in his hometown, where his now the hometown hero, he's now betrothed. He's asked Merced to marry him. So he says, I'm not going into the world can now come to me. And I'm going to start a new aviation company devoted to high performance superplanes. He also, by the way, during this time, designs the Jenny, which is used as the training airplane for World War I. The World's Fair in 1915 the World's Fair in 1915 was called the last fling of naive idealism. Europe was falling into war and everybody fled and came to San Francisco for one last party. Their slogan was peace through commerce. Now here Beachey is outside, this is before the fair opens, he's outside the Palace of Machinery. Now the Palace of Machinery, as we talked about earlier, was the largest framed building on Earth. At one end of it, it had, the farthest end of it, it had Stone Age tools, flint arrowheads, things that made by Stone Age, from the Stone Age. The Flintstones were at the very end. And it proceeded through the epochs. Every an example of every human invention was in this long palace. They brought the actual Gutenberg printing press from Europe to be displayed here. Of course, they had the telegraph, the telephone, the automobile, but at the very end, right by those giant doors you see in the back, at the very end, highest achievement of humankind was Lincoln Beachey's Little Looper. And every day at 3 o'clock, the giant doors of the Palace of Machinery would open, and hometown hero and the world's greatest aviator would fly as the daily acme of human history. Now, as Beechey was designing super planes, high performance planes, he was thinking back to when Sopwith had defeated him in Chicago with a monoplane. So he put one of his Gnome motors on a monoplane of his own. Now, Taba is German for dove, and you can see why. It's very dove-like. This is down in Ocean Beach, just below the Cliff House in San Francisco. And he had no rudder. All of his controls, you see how oversized they are. The flat are quite large. There's no stabilizer here. There's only a rudder. So he can make that machine flip and spin and do anything he wanted. There was one drawback to this Gnome motor. You mixed castor oil with the gasoline. So that's how it stayed lubricated. But the castor oil was thrown out in the exhaust cycle of the piston. So it threw castor oil. Now, the young people today don't know what castor oil is. When in the old days, if you couldn't poo, they would feed you castor oil and it would just let it fly. And so pilots that flew with this plane were known for running to the bathroom a lot. Beechey didn't like that, of course. He also didn't like the fact that he couldn't feel the air so well. He had to hide behind this thing and all suited up. So here he is climbing into it. This is down at Ocean Beach. Warren Eaton spinning the wheel, spinning it, getting it going. And I only wish photography had been as developed as his airplanes. And you can see, no, I don't like castor oil being shot in my face. Hot castor oil, I might add. Now, when the Panama Pacific International Expo opened on February 23rd, 1915, on March 3rd, Lincoln Beechey's birthday, they estimated that the millionth person was going to come through the gates. And so Beechey took his mother up into this part of the Tower of Jewels, where he came down with a smoke generator and wrote 1,000 with his plane for his mother. And there was 50,000 people inside the Panama Pacific International Expo grounds. The only building we have left from this is, of course, the Palace of Fine Arts, which was down at the far western end of it. And the dome was painted a deep orange to represent the setting sun. Merced and Beechey, they walked the crowd, they walked through the fair. He was Mr. Pan Pacific. And the fair officials come to him and say, Beechey, the nations of the world want to finally acknowledge you as the genius of aviation and acknowledge you for your contributions to aviation. It was a dream come true for Beechey because he had always been called crazy, and now they were honoring him as the pioneer. It was the epitome of his life. Here's the medal they were going to present to him, and he was finally not crazy. And so they asked him, would you maybe show off your new Taba monoplane? And he said, sure. And so Beechey Day came, he took off, he flew out. Now, everybody knew that it was a special day. And so the streets were jam-packed. The hills above the Marina Green, every roof, every street, every open space was filled with people. And so the guy who was bringing the gold medal for Beechey couldn't get through the crowds. Beechey went up, he did a show for everybody, and he came down. There was a little water in his gas line, so he cut it a little bit short. He came back down to receive the accolades and the the gold medal finally, and then they were going to celebrate with an after dinner party with the high society. And they ran up to Beachey and they said, "Beachey, the medal's not here yet. Could you go up one more time?" You can see the look on his face. He's not very happy about it. And these are the men from Yosemite, the officials from Yosemite, all stuffed shirts. They said, "Can we have a picture with him?" And Beachey is just not, you can see he's not very relaxed about this moment. Somebody from the crowd says, "You did everything but the dive. Do the dive." Nobody had ever achieved terminal velocity before Beachey, flying straight down. So he acknowledged it. Here is his last. He takes off in front of them at the Marina Green. And this is one of my favorite pictures because he's waving goodbye. The angel's waving hello. You say goodbye and I say hello. And he takes off, flies out over Alcatraz, arches his plane down for the dive, and the stress of the dive breaks his wings straight back. And he's headed for the crowds, but he calmly turns off the motor using just his rudder and rear controls and guides it out toward the water where he lands between these two ships. They estimated he hit the water at 200 miles an hour, and he survived the crash. We know this because the authors show how he scratched his leg. The plane crumpled it down on his legs and broke them, and he is trying to scratch himself free. In the crowds, William Randolph Hearst, the owner of the Examiner newspaper chains, yes, Citizen Kane, that one, he put his arm around Beachey's good friend Eddie Rickenbacker and said, "That's not the end of a man, that's the end of an era." When 45 minutes later, when they hauled Beachey's plane up, somebody in the crowd took off his hat and said, "Hats off to Beachey." Everybody around him with an earshot said, "Hats off to Beachey." And it made like a wave, they said, through the crowd of 50,000. "Hats off to Beachey, hats off to Beachey, hats off to Beachey, hats off to Beachey." You can see him hanging here from his machine. They put him in a boat and they tried resuscitating him for what kind of person in public esteem who crashes at 200 miles an hour into the water, is underwater for almost an hour, and they still won't give up to try to make him come back alive for 3 solid hours. They couldn't believe it, that he was gone. There's the paper from the day before. It says 50,000 watched, but down here it says many times that many are on the streets and the hilltops above. They estimated 250,000 people watched him die. I've interviewed people that watched him die. The mayor personally oversaw the largest funeral in the city's history. They had memorials year after year after the war, and that's when they were going to have the San Francisco airport as the Lincoln Beachey Memorial Flying Park. But it never actually happened, which is a longer story you can read about in the book, which you can get at Hiller Aviation. And that is my show. So let me stop share. There we go. You stop share for me. And
thank you, Frank. That was fascinating. It's always amazing to hear a story. We did go a little long, but thanks for hanging out with us, folks. We're going to continue for just a few more minutes because there may be people who have some questions. And I'll just start it off. By the way, you can, if you do have a question for Frank, type it in the chat here on Zoom using the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom window.
I see them too. Thanks, Sebastian.
And you know, you had brought this up too, and that was that, you know, Lincoln Beachey was accused of inspiring the deaths of a bunch of would-be daredevils because of his reckless way of flying, but he actually practiced pretty rigorously and very systematically. He didn't just, get in the airplane and try one of these stunts and just hope that it worked. He would incrementally master the skill one part of the maneuver at a time. And that's one of the things that he tried to get across so that people would realize that there was science. This wasn't so much art as it was science, because
It wasn't so much bravado as science, yes.
and at the end of the day, he did perish in his aircraft, but it was the aircraft that failed him. I mean, he pushed it beyond its limits. It was an experimental monoplane. But was there anything else about, him being crazy? Were there any other repercussions that he had to deal with, this idea that he was responsible for other people's deaths? Did people try to sue him, or,
They did. They actually, the district attorney of San Diego came out publicly saying they were going to sue him for alienating the lives of a fellow, because so many people were trying to imitate what he did, not practice, as you say. And so he was actually threatened with legal lawsuits to keep from flying because so many people were dying. So, and you're right, he practiced diligently.
There are some,
you know how it is. Anybody that can do a trick, once you master a trick, it looks easy. Right. And somebody else says, "Oh, I can try that." Blah, blah, blah. It happened for him too.
Right. I mean, he really did create aerobatics from the point of view of you learn aerobatics very incrementally and learning certain basic moves and maneuvers, of course, after mastering the aircraft's basic flight capabilities. There are people who are interested in perhaps, having a conversation with you, Frank, or contacting you. What I'm going to suggest that they do is that if you want to email Frank, to just email me, jeff@hiller.org, and then I will pass your request to Frank, and he can address it that way. So we usually try to put an intermediary in the middle of that process right there. Sure. And here's a question. The early aviators and the aviatrixes, and Roy Mize asks, would you say Ruth Law was the female Lincoln Beachey?
Well, I'm not as familiar with Ruth Law. I do know she was an aviatrix, but I'm due to be educated. Let me just leave it at that. He was the pioneer. He invented these things. So when somebody invents it and somebody reproduces it, that's not quite the same. So I still hold that Lincoln Beachey is the latest aviator. Nobody's ever reproduced the Z. I can tell you that. There's nobody, and I know every aviator out there who's listening go, no, it really didn't happen. I've talked to dozens of them, and everybody goes, oh, that's not true.
Well, they may have done it accidentally.
But he did it daily after that.
Right.
So, oh, thank you, Roy. Thank you. Educate me. Absolutely. And yes, this video is recorded.
Yes, the video is recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Well,
my apologies for going over. I tried to cram 3 hours into 40 minutes and I couldn't do it.
Well, I think it was just very fascinating to hear his story. And, he is a icon of San Francisco, and, the sinking of the Lusitania, the onset of World War I kind of erased and put a period point on everything that happened before 1915. And when we got out of the war, everything was just forgotten, and a completely different beginning at that point.
Right, and Lincoln Beachey always was telling his good friend Eddie Rickenbacker, the race car driver, he says, "You really know how to handle a machine. You should become a pilot." And Eddie would always say, "No, that's for you, Beachey." And when Beachey went down, Eddie did become a pilot, and as we all know, he was the leading surviving ace of World War I. At the memorials to Lincoln Beachey held down there in the Marina Green every year, Eddie Rickenbacker was the first host.
And he eventually became the first CEO of Eastern Airlines, I believe.
That's right, exactly.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up right here. I do want to thank our guest, Frank Marrero, out there in the Netherlands. It's 4 o'clock in the morning now. He's got to go back to bed. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight for Hiller Hangar Talk. And please join us 2 weeks from now on March 31st when we host Maryland about the Reno air races. So until then, stay safe. We'll look forward to seeing you here at the Hiller Aviation Museum,
Thanks, Willie.
and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks,
Thanks
Roger.
everybody.
Thanks, Roy. Thanks, Connor. Thanks, Bart. Appreciate it. Love doing it. All righty.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Frank.